Isela had a pet emergency, and pet emergencies are very high on go take care of. So he said, all right, we will try our best to show up and represent. I don't know who's going to ground us.
You can do it.
Oh, goodness. Okay. I'll see if I've learned anything in all these talks.
Okay.
So this is episode 8. We are going to start talking about play, but it's going to probably quickly get into some other things that I swear people should just like jump on before we start recording, because we always have like our best conversations. But Ijuma, as you think about this little 4-letter word of play, what kind of community agreement should we start with today?
You tried to bypass the grounding.
Oh, well, I was buying myself a little time.
See, this is why we need Isela.
For so many reasons. Yeah, go.
Sorry. What I think is going to be important to ground ourselves in working in community, right? Even though we don't have our full community here, but to remember that like this work happens when we're not just by ourselves and thinking by ourselves, that we're actually in community and using that collective work and thinking about our collective work and responsibility. When we talk about play, we talk about equity.
That's going to be important for me to circle back to, Iduma, because when we talk a little bit about cultural differences in play, I want to talk a little bit about part of that community, our families. And so I'm going to put a pin in that.
Okay.
So then if we think about what grounds us, I'm going to really channel Isela for this one. It's like, who are we in the presence of children? But she always talks about what we do with children or beside children. And so I think as we think about play, it's going to be so critical that we think about our role as we play with children, alongside children, especially as that ekes over for somebody like me that loves to embed instruction in play. That starts to make that line a little bit wonky.
Yes.
All right. So I'm gonna keep that right here on my shoulder in my heart.
Okay.
Who am I in the presence of children, and be thinking about who playing alongside, especially when I want to deliver instruction in play. Okay. So
can I ask a question first?
Here. Oh, yes, please.
Why'd you frame play as a 4-letter word?
Oh, because I think that so often when we say we play, people use the other 4-letter word, which is just play. And so I was in my head being funny that sometimes people say, you can't say DAP, you can't say play, because it all has to be rigor. And so it gets a bad rap.
Yeah.
But
when we answer the question, who are we in the presence of children, and we are say anything about being progressive or being child-centered, like play can't be the 4-letter word. Play has to be at the center of what we do and how we allow children to experience the world. Right? Because that's what they bring to our environments.
So when you think of that word, like, I also think it's hard for people because we all have different ideas of what is play. I think some people think it means kids are hanging from the chandeliers. I think some people think it's mature play, out of Tools of the Mind, which mature play as a phrase seems like an oxymoron. Some types of play are okay, but rough and tumble, not. So what's your biggest definition of play or concept? What do you put in that bucket, if you will?
So usually when I talk about play as a value of itself. Like it doesn't have to be attached to learning. It doesn't have to be attached to what adults value. That children's play has a value onto itself. Okay. And then I think about what characteristics I want to see in play. I want to see that it's intrinsically motivated, that it's coming from the child's idea and their imagination or their bodies or their voices, however they're framing it. Thinking about that it has that piece, like when we look for toddlers on up, through adulthood, thinking about that imaginative play that is non-literal. Thinking about play as something that is actively done, right? And so it could be active and like physically active, and it could be active in children before they get into play in that what's called onlooker play, right? Mm-hmm. Like that has value because children are trying to figure out, the social cues, what's going on, how they might contribute. Then they, get into the physical piece of it. And I think that play has, I'm trying to think of I usually have 5, but I think I just have 4 right now. The fifth one or the third, the fifth one isn't coming to me.
We lost things during the pandemic, didn't we?
We did.
Like it used to be able to talk about play like please, and now like play.
But also taking our cues from children, right? And valuing what they come up with. And I also just for me, outside of other people's theories, is that all play is culturally based. That children are playing from their own cultural understanding. And it's not until some outside force comes to try to assimilate them into a white dominant culture notion of play.
Yeah. Okay, so there's 8 things I wanted to follow up with you. I'm going to stay on that one because I can only think what I just heard. So, sometimes when you and I and Gisela, of course, are talking about race in particular, and we talk about, for example, the reason we don't say all lives matter, but that we really say Black lives matter because we don't want to universalize something. When we think of play and play being culturally based, in your experience, in your framing of it, do you see there's some universals across cultures when it comes to play? Or is it so culturally based that it's another invitation for us to understand cultures so much more deeply?
I think it's a both and. I think both things are happening. Just in my own personal professional experience of being in different places where observing children of different cultures playing, that there's some type of imaginative dramatic play. Yeah. That there's, and usually that play is based in recreating their daily lives, right? Even if they don't have a kitchen set or it's set up, they still play, you still see someone pretending they have a baby, somebody being the teacher or the mom, that there's some kind of active participatory part of children's play. And you see children, just playing alone, with materials or without materials. So I think there's aspects of play that can be universal, but in a very broad sense, right?
Right.
So thinking about play itself is universal. I believe that all children, because I believe that all people play, and that play is for the lifespan. Is not just it's the main domain of children, but it's expansive throughout our lifetime. Everyone needs play. Right. So I think in that way, that's how I think of it as universal. But there are cultural aspects to that play, even in universal things. When I think about going back to doll play, I've been in places where most of the infants and what children see is infants being worn, wrapped and carried on the back or carried in the front. But then the play that's offered to them is oh, we're going to raise money to get baby prams or baby strollers. And it's like, but that's not connected culturally to what the children see and think about every day. Right. And so when if you watch their play, like they're showing you the material that they need. So it's not a pram, it's an extra blanket or a piece of material. Right. Because you'll see, like I've been in the rural areas of South Africa, and I've been in a couple of communities in Mexico, and I see babies on children's backs with their sweater or their jacket tied around, and they're walking around doing other stuff, talking to their friends and showing the baby, right? So like they don't need play strollers.
Yeah. And so that's where, when you were speaking to play happens, and then the white dominant culture starts to really narrow and define what types of play, what materials you used, even I think then the value of play, right? Because it goes back to another episode we did about the grit and the grind with standards and third grade reading guarantees and all of these different pressures. The value of play becomes quite diminished and or quite narrow. Even like, I'm going to channel Isela for a minute. You know, when she talks about classroom redesigns, play is not supposed to be on the peripheral.
Right.
Back in the day when we were in classrooms, it was supposed to be at the heart of the classroom and or sprinkled in every part, versus when the work is done, you can go over to that lame area and play, right?
Right.
I added the lame part, sorry. I'm doing a judgment detox, and I failed. Okay, so, but I'm not judging that I judge, just in case anybody's keeping track. Okay, so we've got to think about the culture as the context, certainly. Let me throw one more dimension in here, because this is another thing I often hear, especially in the disability world, where people will say kids with disabilities don't know how to play or can't play or don't play, don't initiate, don't have imagination. So how would we speak in that realm?
Like all of that is not true.
Right? Like, just not.
Have you spent any time with children? Right?
Right?
Like if you spend any time with children, you know none of those things are true. Maybe children need different support and activating their desire to play.
Right.
But they all play. All children have imaginations. They have brains. They have thinking that's going on. They're planning and organizing themselves. And also, like, they want to be in relationship, right? Yeah. Play is a way that children are in relationship with each other.
Yeah.
And all children, like, if we're going to say all and universalize, like, all children want that. And so all children are trying to figure out ways to make that happen.
Yeah.
And so you see children with disabilities, like I'll go into classrooms and they'll like look at me and they'll wink, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll wink back, right? And we start having this, this conversation and this way, and like being silly, and then I'm like, I can't do the other eye, and they're like doing both eyes. Right? And like just in that engagement and thinking of playing and how to connect with people. So all children are have imagination, have play. Does it look like, what the standards and what adults think it should look like? No. But no play really does. Because again, we should be using that word again, child-centered, like figuring out what's going on with children and starting from that place.
Like you said, valuing all types and forms and expressions, I would say, of play. And for me, we talk a lot about presuming competence in the disability community. We talk a lot about adapting or supporting a student, the zone of proximal development, whatever phrases we want to use. And that to me is there's no greater need than to do that, to allow a child to have full expression of play. Like that's the gift that we give, is being child-centered, is noticing their cues, is giving them ways to interact with materials. How else do we learn if we don't interact with materials and people, right? Like,
Exactly. Right.
there's no other way. I mean, yeah.
And
So
if we're going to prioritize, we
yeah,
want to prioritize people over materials, right?
yeah,
Because a
yeah.
lot of times people think like, oh, because they don't have materials, then that means that they're not playing, or they can't play, or they don't have good quality.
Or they don't have a bilateral motor coordination to hold
Right.
these toys, so we got to work on bilateral motor coordination.
Yes.
No offense, OTs, before we can. Versus like wink, right? Just have that fun exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I always think about rough and tumble play for kids with disabilities, because I think sometimes people are like, ooh, they're fragile, or, ooh, you know, and certainly there are some kids where we have to be more cautious about certain things, you know. But for the most part, what kid doesn't want to be like knocking it around with another kid, you know?
Yeah.
And that's how you get feedback. It's too much.
Yes. And so if we're going to trust children, right? So one of the things about rough and tumble play, like we trust children to know their own body, right?
Yeah.
That in this rough and tumble play, like they know their boundaries, they know what works and what doesn't work. And all children should have access to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like I've seen children children in wheelchairs like unclick themselves and just hurl them like while she's on their way and just hurl themselves out and just rolling around on the floor with their friend, right?
Exactly. So if I need bilateral motor coordination, so I can undo my belt so I can't roll out, right? Yeah. Oh, I just love that. That was just such a beautiful idea. You know, I could see it in my mind, in my heart. Yeah. So this idea of, and I think we're going to find that when people think about, oh, we've lost time during the pandemic and we've lost ground and kids got to make it up. If you want to hear me say anything we've lost, it's time and play across the lifespan. I know I haven't played. I wasn't a good player or napper before, but now I really, really am not good.
Yeah.
You know? So what do you say to that, Ijuma? I know we've been trying to help people not say that we're trying to make up or catch up, or how do we help early childhood educators with all this added pressure now really keep play at front and center?
So I think it's like figuring out how to use what we have, right? How we figured out how to use other materials, how we use technology to continue to play. Right? We can't like be together, you know, share physical space yet, but there are other ways to use technology, like to play around and to be silly and to be imaginative, and figuring out how to do that. For some people, you know, thinking about that's not cost prohibitive. And so thinking, so maybe going old school and like sending matching games, you know, like when I was, you know, a young teacher, and get those magazines and do matching games, or send other card games, figure out like, encourage children to find manipulatives at home.
Yeah.
Right? What they have a lot of in their home that might be small or might be big. Thinking about like dance, like adults are doing like Zumba and dance classes. Right. So like you could be doing some dance stuff. You could be doing all kinds of movement and music online with children.
Right. Know? There's nothing from that perspective. And I think even just like you said about imaginary play and how important that is, that pretend play, we don't even need any materials. I mean, sure, we have to scaffold and support that for kids who are not yet engaging in imaginary play, but talk about inexpensive or accessible, just what's up here. So when Isela and I were saying, hey, do you want to do this on play? You're like, I'm all in, right? And I know you have a Facebook group on play and equity. What kind of big topics, and we just read an article on, it's called Start with Equity, 14 Prioritize to Dismantle Systemic Racism in Early Care and Education.
That's a mouthful.
That's a mouthful. And so when we got on today, Ijuma says to me, and I was like, what? What'd you see? And she's like, there's no mention of play. So tell me a little bit about that.
So, right. So we're going to have policies and we're going to acknowledge what's
Look
wrong
who's
with
here.
the system.
A second. Pluck!
Hi.
Hi.
We were trying to
Welcome.
move along without you.
I was
right.
watching. I was listening to you all. We've got kind of a family thing going on right now, but I
Okay.
was able to jump on.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Sorry. So I got excited, Ijuma, because I was listening to you, but then I saw Isela in the green room.
I know. That's exciting too. It's manageable. Like it's okay to be here.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
If
my kid is at a calm place right now. So
Okay.
Okay.
If anything changed, you can pop off.
thank you.
What was I? What was I saying? You
Well, I was
distracted.
trying to say the play was missing from.
Oh yeah. Like naming that. So if we're going to advocate and we're going to talk about equity and public policy, like we have to do it within a framework of play for young children. Like there's no early education without play. And like part of the equity problem is that all children don't have access to that.
I had read somewhere the more marginalized a child, the less time they spend in play. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Research reports after report says that over and over.
Says that over and over, right? And marginalized for whatever. And many of these kids, as we know, are going to have multiple reasons that they've been marginalized, right? Isela, we were doing both play and the report. You can jump in right here or take us to what you were originally thinking too.
You know what it reminded me of when I did that kindergarten work. I did kindergarten work. Well, it was kindergarten through second grade, where the teachers that we were attracting in Arizona, we were really trying to kind of bridge that gap of understanding of what young children really need in terms of their educational experiences. And for many K-2 teachers, it was like the first they had heard of it, because they had never gone as a child. They had never had experience of having any kind of play-based approach, any kind, not even like the old school where when you're done working, you get to play. Like that has been out of our K3 classrooms for a very long time. Yeah. And so it was all new information for them. And one particular district in Arizona, a really large district, we visited about 6 or 7 schools. And I remember the school that was sort of in the inner city of Tucson had absolutely nothing in terms of resources. And it wasn't that they just didn't have resources. It's that there wasn't a value of the approach of integrating any type of child-centered, play-based learning approach, experience, nothing. It was, we're going to sit and we're going to do E.L.A. and we're going to do math and social studies and science is a maybe once a week kind of thing. And so when I looked around the classroom, the teacher who's eager and young and excited, and she's got like 6 tables, a U-shaped table, which I just wish they were never invented. The U table, the desk, which takes up like a third of the room, right? Yeah. And a carpet, a large carpet. And she was like, okay, so what can we do? I'm like, burn the kidneys. And what's hard is that because there's no value in that playful experiences, right? Playful, like engagement of just allowing children to imagine, allowing children to be who they naturally are, right? There isn't an understanding of the value in that, that it becomes so difficult to translate into experiences where teachers have never had that background. They don't have any understanding of how play can be learning. And we come from the place of doing 2 children, right? Still that lens of doing 2 children. So how do I teach them? How do I do, instead of just stepping back and watching what it is that they're exploring and doing? I mean, I come from poverty. And so we made rocks into something. that was part of our play-based experience, but there isn't the value in that. And so for me, the schools that really needed more of, I won't say more, but needed the play, it was like the equal amount, or they needed the experience to be able to engage and play and all of that. It was fine in the other schools, but not in this school, because these kids need X, Y, and Z drilled into them. Yeah.
And so like there's this cultural deficit, right?
Yeah.
That these children are culturally deficit. And so they don't need what the other children need. Like, so, and that's usually read as play, right? Play is a luxury.
Yes.
And so children that are seen in the deficit model, they don't deserve luxury, right? They're poor. So poor people get poor stuff.
Yeah.
And poor people don't know better. And so we're going to teach them to get them ready. I hate that term. That kindergarten readiness thing, we're doing the kindergarten work. I'm like, how about we just be in the moment and be like the best preschool experience ever? Then we're not going to sit here and drill up all the kindergarten crap that really, truthfully, if we did a solid play-based approach where we really watched children, really looked at what excited them, instead of this, and this is another thing that I get all the time. What color is it?
Yeah.
How many? Teacher, look what I did. How many are there? I'm like,
yeah. So don't ask children questions that you know the answer to, right? Right. Don't ask, like,
it's a question.
So if one of the children in my classrooms went to that classroom, they're like, you don't know? How come you don't know?
Yeah. Okay. I just have to say for a second, you've got these one-liners. You keep getting quoted, Ijuma, but now I can see why. Don't ask the question you know an answer to.
Right.
If that were the rule, we would no longer have special education. Like, that is the broadest statement I think I've ever said, the broadest generalization. But seriously, that would be what, and I would say the same thing as you said, Isela, that play is a luxury and those kids need these other skills because they, are poor, blah, blah, blah. I would say same thing with a kid with a disability. People are going to feel like we're doing a disservice or something unethical by allowing them to play when they don't have these core adaptive skills. And I think that carries all the way through. I was just talking to a family of a fourth grader, and because the child has some, I think, rather small needs, they want to put him in a life skills classroom, because how else is he going to learn life skills?
How do you learn life skills?
Right.
So, like, if we see children as confident, if we see children as learners, right? We don't have to teach for children to be learners, right? Children are curious about the world. And so we're just ignoring what they want to learn about, because we don't attach it to like what their interests are. And we have to know these arbitrary things about what people should know and what people shouldn't know. Like, you have a whole lifetime of learning to do.
Yeah, and play.
Right? And play. And so some basic skills like happen, right? Like, children are highly motivated to learn how to read and write.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The only time they're not is when we do those silly things like asking, what color is this? What letter is this? Like, when we drill them.
Right.
Because then it's like, why does anybody want to be questioned and interrogated about things all the time, right? Yeah. But if we just have, embedded colors and numbers and numeracy, if we're just doing that in the everyday, like we do in real life, right? Like, we use math, we use color, like we use written language in our everyday life, and children want that too. They don't want it siloed in these little lessons. They want it, like, they want to know, like, well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of times I've motivated children to write because I'm like writing notes and doing observations. And then you see other children sitting next to me with their pad and pencil, either real or pretend, like writing things down.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so that happens in play-based environments. Mm-hmm. When you give the message that, like, you can be yourself. Right. And what you're interested in, I'm interested in. And we can do something about it.
The other thing that I would do as a classroom teacher is every child is a contributing member.
Mhm.
And as a contributing, significant member of the classroom, everyone has a skill set or a gift to offer or something that they're like a content expert of.
Yeah.
And one of the things in our kindergarten classrooms, I think when I was a preschool teacher, I used to talk about, like one particular child might be really good at tying shoes, or one child might be really good at copying certain words, and, a child who might get stuck with that. I would say, I wonder, I think we have an expert. We actually would have like a directory of services with children who were deemed experts. And I said, I think we might have somebody in our directory of services who's really good at that. Why don't you check that out? And so it's the idea that we're all contributing members, and we're all learning from one another, that there's this shared value of learning together. And I think that's an important part of building community within the classroom, which in a lot of the classrooms I've been in, it's so individualized, right? Who's the fastest, who's the smartest, who's the quietest, who's the estest, And
who's the Estes?
who's the Estes, yeah. And then we become competitive in nature because we want to shine, we want to be special, we want to be different. And culturally, that goes against so many cultures in terms of the values that are deemed important in the home. So what happens to me as a kid who at home, I get the message of, together we will. And in the classroom, I don't shine, so I'm, not the best. And so building this sense of community where every child is contributing, I think is such, but it really requires, as you were talking, Juma, it really requires that willingness to really be careful observers, be so in tuned and attuned to what children are saying in their play.
Yeah.
And it's that, and for me, it's always doing with. I'm doing with children. So I'm sitting as an observer, as someone who wants to know more about how they're thinking, what they're wondering about, asking questions, but it not becoming my agenda. There's a real fine line for me there, where all of a sudden it becomes the teacher's agenda, and I'm like, that ain't got nothing to do with you.
Right.
Well,
and so you want to ask children about their ideas versus trying to get content out of them, or figures and facts, right? So you ask children about, well, what's your idea with this? Or curious about oh, how'd you make that work?
Yeah, I ask stuff like, what do you think you're going to do next? How are you going to make that stand that way? Because you tried it, and it kept tumbling over. What will you do next? So for me, it's really trying to understand.
So here's my question for y'all. So we sometimes use the phrase play partner. And so before you jumped on, Isel, I was telling Ijuma that I wanted to come back to, her community agreement today was to be in community and to really leverage our community as we want to advocate for changes around play. And I was saying, let's bring families into that. When we talk with families about their role in play, so there's two questions kind of. Ijuma, I asked you earlier, are there universals that are at play as well as cultural things to be considered of? When we encourage families or teachers to be play partners, are there universals and some cultural things to be aware of? Do you see where I'm going? How do we guide teachers and parents to be play partners while still being culturally sensitive and relevant?
So are you assuming that being play partners is based in one culture and not another?
Well, I don't know. So I think first, what would a play partner look like? I heard you guys describing what they would ask and do. And I remember I told you one time I was in Minnesota and I was talking about being a play partner and I was explaining some things like these. And a woman said, that may not be the right way to do it in every culture. And so this kind of open-ended questioning, this being curious about what kids are doing, this playing alongside, being child-directed, letting kids follow kids' lead, are those universal enough?
So what cultures?
I don't know.
Is it? So what culture was she talking about that wouldn't work with all cultures?
I know. So she disclosed that she was a Latina, but I was on the stage as my white self going, crap, I did it again. So of course the sharks came, the lid flipped, and I don't remember anything else.
Okay.
Okay.
And so this idea about, we've named it about collectivism versus individualism.
Okay.
Right. So we understand that individualism is based in white dominant culture. But the majority cultures are more collective and collaborative. Okay. Right. That's my home culture. That's how I was raised. Isela said that. Right. So that's the cultural framework. And that's the cultural framework I bring to the children. And I also know, but that isn't the dominant culture. That is going against what I learned in my ECE classes, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But I also know, so like naming that and naming that a lot of that individualism, like who does that serve and what is that based in? And so maybe, yeah, there's probably other cultures that are non-white that are individualistic, but probably not. Like I can't think of one off the top of my head. So if someone says because like, oh, we don't do that because of my culture, like I will always ask more questions about that. Because what's their understanding about what their cultural norms are?
So I want to kind of speak from I would say more both professional and personal experience around, because what you just said, I think is important. Like, what is your understanding of your culture in terms of, what you believe about play in my particular family? So I waited 18 years to have Gia. So we waited a very long time to have her. Because I didn't want to repeat the generational cycle of abuse that I had endured as a child. So that was a really important thing for me. And but my family didn't have a good understanding of what I did for a living, like zero. So all of the advice, right, about what I should do with my kid came out. Yeah. I was like, okay, I know a little bit about kids. I've been doing this for a little while. So when I'm with my family, my extended family, and I'm with children, I'm with children. Like I sit and I engage and we sing songs together, and my nephew comes out and shows me pictures and he says, look, Thea, let me show you what I did. And I'm like, oh my goodness, tell me about your picture. And what were you, tell me, say more about this here. Cause I'm really interested in what you did over here. It's still super, super artistic. And so I would engage in these conversations with them. And my stepmom would say, Mia, look at her. Look at what she's doing. That's the way we should be talking to them. And she was very well aware that I like engaged in conversations with them. And then she says, she in a sort of reflective about it, she goes, yeah, we don't do that. She said, we just tell them to go wash their hands and come eat. Right. So she was aware, but in her awareness, she also said, I don't know how to talk like that with all of them. She's got, I've got all these nieces and nephews and all these grandchildren. So it was a really nice reflective conversation with my stepmother about the engaging in terms of language with my nieces and nephews. Mm-hmm. And I think that when I go into classrooms, sometimes I see that as well. And sort of the directive sort of approach, go wash your hands, go do this, but not a whole lot of engagement in terms of, conversations about.
So I resonate with that, Isela, and that's why I guess I was thinking or reflecting on myself. Like I was promoting or suggesting, because I was doing PD, that this is how we are beside children. This is how we are play partners, And then when somebody said that's maybe not appropriate for all cultures, I was thinking to myself, but I feel like there's some things that are universal about how humans like to connect or be curious or be engaged, and open-ended over close-ended. And then I got to questioning, well, maybe that's part of my, I don't know. I didn't feel like it was part of white dominant culture, but so much of me is, right? So that was my question. I didn't do a very good job.
I feel like the response that it doesn't have to be universal to make it the right thing.
Okay.
So I think like that's the part that you might be.
That I got messed up on.
Yeah. And I think that the other piece of like Isela's story is like the conversation that I have with my family and other people that I share a racial and cultural identity with, and thinking about like, why is there like a lot of directive? Why is there like, oh, just go wash your hands, and not being playful and like being very serious? Yeah. Like that's actually a response to white supremacy. Right. That's actually comes from a place of trying to keep children safe and keep children contained. So maybe they aren't harmed by the racist world that they live in.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and it's not, and so a lot of times we think that that's like a universal practice in our culture, when it's actually just one of the responses of trying to keep children safe. Because sometimes you'll hear, well, that's how white people talk to their kids. Like that we don't do that here. Yeah, and I'm like, well, actually, that's the way my mom talked to me, right? Right. But my mom was an educator, and she was an artist. One of her best friends when I was born was actually a child development instructor and a parenting coach before there were parenting coaches, and ran a play group. And so like my mom actually didn't know, but her friend insisted like, no, you have to, like, that baby needs to be with other kids and play. Yeah. And so I was like, and she tells the story of how like she needed support, and she, met other moms and took me to play group, but that wasn't like from her idea. Because she says, she did think like, well, yeah, that's what white people do. And her friend was like, no, that's what like moms need. Like, that's what parents need. So like, come and do this. And like, this is how we talk to children. This is how we encourage their play. Right. And so, yes. And then talking about how that still supports children's development, how that's going to keep us safe, how that's going to give us a place to advocate for and advocate from, and having a different relationship. Yeah. And it's not cookie color and universal. Like, it's not about universalizing. It's about understanding families' reaction to that. Right. And not just dismissing, well, that's just their culture. Right. Because a lot of administrators, you hear that, well, we don't really do play because that's not the family's culture, and they don't want that. Right.
So we have a comment from Kim G on that very thought. So I don't know if you guys can see the chat.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, I can't.
Isela, you want to make your last comment?
What was I going to say? That comes up a lot when you get into the kindergarten up world, where it's like, we don't value play. Our families don't value play. Right. Because we want them to, especially those back to basic schools, and we don't do that here.
We have a lot of families that are from, I get this all the time, that are, Asian descent. I don't know why, but like, they don't want that. They want just the curriculum, these broad, you don't understand, in our community, like Silicon Valley or blah, 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 the families don't want us to play.
Mm-hmm. And I think what Kim is saying, having those conversations with families about, what, even if we're not saying like, for me, it's saying like, what kinds of things do you do at home for fun? What kinds of things is there anything that you do playful as a family? What do you enjoy doing together? It's like having those conversations to really get to know who they are as a family unit, and then even inviting them into the classroom. And children to see that their families are an integral part of the community. Right. I think it's such an important part.
And talking to them about their concern, because I've always said to parents, like, they come to open house, like, this is all fun and games, but I know some of y'all thinking like, but are they learning here? What's going on? That's right. Mm-hmm. So like, let's talk about that, right? Like, it's not going to be as obvious because it's maybe not the same experience you had, right? Like, you remember school being like K-12 sitting at a desk. But that's only going to be one type of learning. Mm-hmm. Right. And a lot of times what's offered is actually pseudo academic that people are just trying to make money off of, based on parental fear that their child won't excel. But we know, because, we're child development experts, that children learn on a continuum.
You
right?
know,
And eventually everyone gets to where they need to be and where they want, right? They need support.
Right.
And that's the role that we play.
In all my years as a classroom teacher, I'd never been questioned by a parent. In the beginning, yes. In the beginning, yes, because, you do that first welcome to the classroom and this is what we're going to be doing. And, we're going to be exploring and discovering and da, 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 da. But, they're like, well, yeah, how are they going to learn? And what about their alphabet? And what about their numbers? And, are they going to be ready to read? And, but within a couple weeks, because of the depth of the experiences that we would have, when children expressed an interest in something, we would actually take a trip to the library. This was before internet times, guys. And so we would go check out books, and I let the kids check out as many books as they could carry. We would do some research based on their own interests. I go, okay, what can you create that represents your learning? Like, really, let's figure out how you could show that you're collecting information. And I had a little boy been kicked out of school. And he came to me, and mom was in near tears, and she was in tears. And she's like, I don't know what else to do. And I figured out his frustration was that he struggled with writing. And I put a keyboard in front of him and I said, just type your ideas. And that kid went from frustrated to being he typed everybody's reports. He typed up all their notes. And this was a 5-year-old. I mean, he's an attorney now, and the mom still says, still to this day says that it changed her mind about her child, seeing him in an environment where he really could see himself as somebody who was an incredible learner.
Yeah. And I think, like, a lot of times when we talk about collectivism, we talk about, being in cooperative communities, like, people like push back. Well, then how are children going to, be their individual selves? Like, you just told that story, because within our communities, like, you get to be your individual self and get to bring your skills, and you're really seen, versus individualism usually is connected to competition. And then competition, only the best, only the S's gets to be seen. In cooperative and collective community, everyone is seen.
Right. And everybody is seeing, and we value. It's like we value the contributions that every single person has. Right. There's a comment from Susan that I would love to
go for
have a discussion about. It says, so for play-based learning, are there ever sit-down lessons? How do you teach kids to write to be ready for kindergarten? Okay, I would like to jump in on this because I did the.
You read it. I already knew you wanted to talk about it, so go ahead.
So I wish we would stop saying kindergarten readiness. Quite honestly, I wish, and I get that, but we're projecting into a future. And if we just got really good at being fully present with preschool age children, with young children, we wouldn't need to get ready for kindergarten. We would just need to be in tuned with what they're interested in. And there are many lessons, but the lessons are within the context of their experiences. And so a child is saying, oh, no, I don't want anybody to touch my building. Nobody touch this because I've been working a long time. I said, I wonder how we could help the other kids know that this is your building. And I always have writing materials everywhere, examples of print everywhere so that it's rich. And children are, so let's say I say, there's a postcard there with some markers. Maybe you can write a sign of some sort. And what would be a good thing to write, do you think? And stop, keep away, don't touch. And I said, we had a list of those words. Do you remember where that might be? And so I'm constantly creating as a teacher, as children are needing the language to say, the language to write. And so at that point, I'm going to sit with that particular child or the small group of children that have now come around, because that's what happens. And we start to have a conversation about what does those words sound like? And so this is like going into kindergarten, where children are already naturally curious about words, about letters, about their names, the names of their friends. And so I start to integrate that within the context of the experience so that it's rich and it's meaningful and they care about it. When we silo it out and they don't care about it, they can't make connections to build the foundations that they need for their continued growth, learning, and development. This is where we go all wrong. When we don't make connections to what's important to them.
Right.
And sometimes we just get stuck around what we value. And so in my classrooms, because I had like a couple of parents like, well, I never see them sitting down learning, right?
Yeah.
Like they just kept harping on that. Like their child was already reading.
Right.
Right. but they kept talking about that. So every day in my small group, I just held a meeting and we sat at the table. And I just took pictures of us sitting at the table having our meeting. Somebody took some notes, right? And talk and like the words they wanted to talk about. And so that's how we sat down in our chairs and did some learning. Right. And so it was it was documented, it was in their child's portfolio, and they were like, oh, okay. Like and the children were excited, like, yes, we're gonna have an important meeting. And we're gonna sit down in the chair and people pulling up chairs. And like we did some kind of work together. And I was like, oh, because like a lot of children's parents worked in offices. And so like they knew like they had meetings and like somebody had to take notes. Like that wasn't even my idea. That was like one of the children's idea. So somebody would just come and just write notes.
Well, maybe one I did too, just another synonym. Whenever we studied, because remember, Ijuma, I said I'd put a pin in embedding instruction into play as a phrase. But the key characteristic of that work is that you create a match. And the match is between you. So it's to Isela, attunement, right? So I'm attuned with you. My pace is matched with you. My body language, my length of utterance. So I'm attuned, but I'm also matched with what you're curious and interested in. So that's all that way back to if you're stacking, I'm not going to ask you what colors you have unless you're trying to alternate colors and we're trying, that's your focus. So when you tell that story, Ijuma, about coming to the table, for me, what you did was you stated a match, but you added a little bit of novelty, which I think a good teacher does, is like, let's just see what happens. But it was still a match for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my key word, is that there's always a lesson. Everything is a teachable moment, and play is where children learn, not just a free for all and not without adults at their side as partners in play, but that has to be a match.
Yeah.
So,
and I think like I'm thinking or remembering about like a lot of times it's just about adult power, about having power over children versus being with children, playing with children, and playing with their ideas and being with them. So like that's the piece we have to let go. Like when we talk about school readiness and getting ready for kindergarten, like we're trying to have control of a future that we actually don't know.
Right.
Like going through this pandemic is an example of that.
Yeah.
Like there was no lesson plan. You weren't prepared. Nobody was prepared for it. Like you didn't do anything to get ready for the pandemic. And that's how life is.
Yeah.
And so there's no guarantee, right? Yeah. Like there's no guarantee. Like you can sit children down and have worksheets and have all this stuff, but that's not guaranteed that kindergarten is going to be ready for them. Because that's what schools need to be ready for children, not the other way around.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's the willingness to not be in charge. So it's like there's a control factor, right? But also, as you were talking, Christy, I thought of a little boy. One time we made Play-Doh. I used to make Play-Doh all the time in the classroom with children. And, but I don't measure anything because in my family culture, we don't measure when we cook. We just throw stuff together. And so I threw stuff together, or we threw as a whoever was at the table with me, we threw stuff together to make Play-Doh, and we had too much water and we had no more flour. And I said, okay, I pulled out everything from the closet that we could potentially use. It had like a floury substance, so cornstarch and cocoa powder and all of that. So we started throwing stuff together. And I said, well, what do you think we could do next? Like, what do you think we should do? So we created like this almond joy chocolate Play-Doh kind of thing. And it was like the most amazing thing ever. And it's what propelled us into like a 2-month exploration of flour and dough and salt and how much salt do you put in it? And what happens when you put 1 cup, 1-to-1 salt and flour? What happens when you put less? What happens when you put cornstarch in there? And so what ended up wasn't at all what I had planned, but it had created this, and we did math and we did reading and we did writing and we did all of this stuff that was so meaningful to kids. And at the very end, they were writing their own recipes. I mean, it really, because they understood the properties. And so it's the willingness to trust that kids know and show up, knowing it, like they have this intuitive nature about what's exciting, interesting to them. And we don't have to ask all the questions about it. We just have to be willing to listen with our heart and move in that direction.
Listen with our hearts. Okay, I think that's a drop the mic moment.
And please stop asking children what color is it? How many numbers are that? Please, just stop. And the worst.
Like, you know who likes that?
What?
Like 18 months to 24 months. You have like that small window, right?
That's right. That's right.
Like, what's this? What's that? Yeah. Right? Yeah. Like, you got like a week.
Yeah.
Get it all out then.
And please stop asking about the peas. I don't know how many times, like at lunchtime, when they're like, why aren't you eating that chicken? Don't you like your chicken? Why aren't you, how many peas do we have? Oh, look, you ate a pea. I'm like, come to my house and let me talk to you about the food and why you haven't eaten.
But also, like, it's not the individual teacher's fault, right? There's lots of workshops, big time money workshops. They're telling teachers to do that.
Yeah. Well, there's accountability measures that principals are coming in and saying, how many times did you ask a higher level thinking question?
But those aren't higher level thinking questions.
I know that, but you know what I mean.
What's on the list. That's what's on the checklist. Yeah. That's what people are being trained to do.
Yeah. It's been almost an hour. Can you all believe it?
I can't.
And I'm like at the very tip of my...
I know. We're just getting in. We're just getting revved up, people. I hope you're all comfy. You might want to get something to drink. We're going to be here a while. Oh, girls. Okay. Well, I don't know that you'll want to talk about the report. Maybe we'll save that for next time and build on this. Yeah. All right. So let's wrap it up. Let's like either a takeaway or I appreciate what you just said, Ijuma, because I know it's so important in our work that we don't want to be one more criticism of teachers, one more voice that's criticizing folks that are out there working so hard every day. So I appreciate that. But is there anything y'all want to say one more time? Wrap it up. I know I'm not putting a bow on it and getting closure. Don't you worry. Don't you worry, Ijuma. Just for now.
I think what Isela said, like part of teaching, like teaching is art, more of an art than a science. So listening from your heart to trusting yourself, right? If you're going to trust children, you also have to trust yourself that you know how to respond. And also like getting that feedback from children, right? You don't have to take the pressure off. You don't have to know all the ideas. You don't have to plan it to a T, right? Make an offering and see what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
I think for me, kind of to go along with what you just said, trusting children, I think is huge. We've lost trust in children completely, especially the older the child gets. You know, I trusting children, learning to trust yourself. But in truth, the reasons why teachers don't trust themselves is because they weren't given the freedom, right? They haven't been given the freedom to make those kinds of decisions in their classrooms for children, for themselves. And so I want to kind of go into the leadership aspect of this, is that as classroom teachers, unfortunately, we're in the position right now that you have to learn the language of explaining to an administrator the value of what is happening. Yeah. So when an administrator comes in and sees flour everywhere because you're making, you know, trying to figure out how to do, you have to be able to say, oh, let me tell you what we're doing. We are figuring out the correspondence between da 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 da, and this is helping children da 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 da. Yeah. Because I think that we have to be able to articulate and fight the system. I'm not telling you I'm going to go out and get fired, but the reality is
don't get fired.
No, we're not telling you to get fired. What we're saying is that there are reasons and there's a value in this experience. And let me share that with you.
Yeah. And they'll get tired of coming to you because they won't want to hear you. Because you don't want to get me started about why this is relevant. They usually only come around once.
This is true.
But I think that closes us up in the sense that all play has value, and as Ijuma started us coming together in community so that we don't get fired, right? But that there is a larger community that we can leverage and support each other to see the value of play throughout the lifespan. Yes. All right. Thank you. Thanks to everyone that joined us.
Thanks,
you can see in the comments.
Thank you. Wow, we have so many people.
I know, right? So give out some love and I'll wrap it up.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.